When I was a kid, I used to spend hours lying on the ground, looking up at the clouds, trying to find images that would occur naturally. I would look for faces, I would look for animals, maybe even the silhouette of a city. I would do this for hours on end. What I didn't realize then, which I realize now, is that I was exercising my ability to perceive the world around me as something other than what it was. I was strengthening my creativity. I went into public school and tried to attend art classes like other creative kids do, and all of my efforts were met with the response that I didn't need art. I just didn't need art to get through school. When I went on to college, this clicker is not working. I'm clicking the wrong button. Sorry. Sorry, everybody. I, I make things, I don't present them verbally, so bear with me. I'm going to do my best on this. So I went into college, and for the first time in my life, I had the option to choose the classes that I would take in an educational environment. I took my first art class when I was 20 years old, and I had this guy, his name is Brinsley Terrell, as my professor. Brinsley was a classically trained sculptor who carved stone, modeled clay, carved wood. I would study with Brinsley. I would work with him for 5 years, and I would eventually start creating his work for him. I worked as his assistant, I was his mentor. But in that very first class that I had in college, I had Brinsley, and we had a life modeling exercise where we had to recreate a young woman's likeness in clay. So we modeled in clay for about 2 weeks, sculpting away, and then we cast it in plaster after we modeled it in clay. We made a mold of it, cast it in plaster, and put a patina on the outside of the sculpture and presented it to the entire class and to Brinsley for feedback, to see what everybody thought of what we had made. Brinsley, when it came my turn to receive feedback from Brinsley, Brinsley said something to me that would change my life forever. He told me that instead of creating an exact replica of the person in front of me, that I should try to use the clay to create planes that would reflect light and cast shadows. And with those reflections and those shadows, sculpt an illusion of the likeness of the person in front of you. That's not right. My brain completely exploded, and the way that I would perceive the physical world had changed forever. When I looked out at the world, I was no longer seeing objects, I was seeing reflections of objects and the shadows that those objects would cast. I became obsessed with this and started making artwork with a literal interpretation of what he told me. I was using clay to model planes that would reflect light and cast shadows and generate illusions of images. This was one of the first sculptures I ever made. On the left, the same artwork on the left and on the right. When you stand in one correct vantage point, you see the illusion on the left. When you walk around it, it explodes. Next work I made was not quite as good, but along the same lines, trying to figure out different ways of making marks in three-dimensional space. The first one I was hanging things, the second one I was putting them up on rods. But I was essentially doing the same thing. I was creating an illusion of an image. Then when you walked around it, it would expand and turn into something else. I also started working directly with shadows, pounding thousands of nails into surfaces of wood, putting a light above them so that it would generate an image. So I was taking his advice very literally. And what really attracted me to this work, what I really started to like about it, was the way that this traditionally flat medium of image making was existing in three-dimensional space for me. these artworks were both two-dimensional and three-dimensional at the same time. They were abstract and representational. As you would walk around them, these representational images that you could recognize would transform and change into something completely different. So I started experimenting with every material I could think of to get this technique to happen, to get this situation to occur, for these two-dimensional images to have three-dimensional properties. Is that I started using video and slide projectors, projecting photographs and video onto pretty much everything I could think of. Spools of barbed wire. The first one was a pile of wood that my father was projected onto. My father taught me how to work with wood. I was trying to figure out ways to connect my subject to the materials and do this 2D, 3D thing that I was doing. It's an image of my mother projected onto the water tower in the town that I lived in. So I was going everywhere. I was projecting onto tree lines. I was projecting onto water towers, projecting onto bugs. I was projecting onto custom-made 3D textural screens that I would make to get the correct effects. This is right about the same time that Photoshop invented filters for photos, just so you know. So I was creating like these real-time live filter effects for photographs that you couldn't, at that point in time, couldn't create. When I first started editing photos in Photoshop, they were destructive. If you took the paintbrush and made a mark on a photo in Photoshop, you ruined it. There was no going back. So just to give a little context of when these images are being made. So I projected onto everything I could think of. I even projected onto moving objects at times. This is a video that I projected onto a moving train. This is part of a portrait that I created for a friend of mine who, he asked me to create a portrait because he needed help. He had this condition called NF2, or neurofibromatosis. And he wasn't able to get medical attention for his situation because it was a pre-existing condition. His employers wouldn't give him medical attention. They wouldn't help him with it. He couldn't get health insurance for it. So he was stuck. He was stuck with this giant tumor on his head. It was collapsing his ear canal. Couldn't see out of his eye. He was about to lose his eye. His jaw was falling apart. But he's this incredibly sweet, optimistic guy. He's really incredible. He really inspired me. So this is Ed. So Ed and I created this video so he could get onto this television show called Extreme Makeover. It's a television show where they'll give you a boob job and a facelift and all this stuff, to make you look the way that you want to look. And Ed saw this as an opportunity to fix his face. So we created this video, and then Ed, as he was submitting his application for Extreme Makeover changed gears, went in a different direction with their production, and became Extreme Home Makeover. They were now renovating homes. And this is in the middle of his application process. So Ed's hopes at getting the tumors removed were pretty much crushed at that point. So at this time, I was living in Ohio. I finished my education. I did my graduate studies, moved out of Ohio, and started teaching at various universities around the country. I first found myself in Georgia, the land of bamboo. I was teaching at a university in Georgia. I was working with natural materials around me to try to figure out different ways of doing this thing that I was fascinated in, creating images in three-dimensional space, illusions of images. So I was working with natural materials. Bamboo is very invasive. Everybody in Georgia hates it, so everybody wants you to cut it out of their yard. So I had this massive amount of free material that I could work with. So I worked with a lot of bamboo. And while I'm in Georgia and I'm making art, there's this buzz around this political candidate that just pops on my radar. Everybody's obsessed with Barack Obama, the young senator from Chicago, Illinois. I had never seen such a buzz around a single individual. It was intense. I don't really subscribe to things about popular culture, but I witnessed them. I'm not really into politicians. I've never really supported a politician. It's not my thing. If I'm going to support you, I have to meet you, I have to sit down and talk to you and have a conversation before I can really get behind you. But I noticed all of this obsession with Barack Obama. So I sat down at the computer. I thought to myself, if I make portraits of Barack Obama, he's showing up in the newspaper every day. There's like 4, 5, 6 new images of him every day. I thought to myself, they're going to run out of images. They're going to need as many images as they can get. So if I make a bunch of artworks that are images of Barack Obama, they'll get picked up by the media, and my artwork will get delivered to a larger audience. So I went to the studio. Well, first I went to the computer and I checked the internet. I checked for Barack Obama sculpture, Barack Obama painting, Barack Obama drawing, Barack Obama this and that, everything. And there was nothing there. That's something I do before I make anything. I check to see if someone else has already done it. So there was nothing. Actually, there was one thing. There was a portrait of a sculpture of Barack Obama as Jesus Christ. And that was the only thing that had been created. So I went to the studio and I created all these portraits of Obama. I did a bunch of pastel drawings. I did these wire sculptures that when you walk around them, they transform. This one specifically was created out of high tension wire to kind of play into the metaphor of the tension of the election. This one is the next generation of the shadow art that I showed at the very beginning. This is a portrait of Barack Obama that if you turn the lights off, it's completely gone. It doesn't exist. This is another shadow drawing. So almost all of these artworks were on the covers of magazines at some point in time. All these artworks appear in books. At the time, they were on television. They were on the front page of all the newspapers in the local area. They were all over the internet. They got millions of views. It went crazy. Literally, the day that I published photos of these artworks, I published them all at the same time. The day that I published the images of these artworks, CNN called 2 hours later, and the artworks were on television that day. It was crazy. It just exploded. And it was what I was hoping for, but it was even more media attention than what I was hoping for. And I was very overwhelmed by it. You can see how overwhelmed I am just being on stage in front of you guys. Can you imagine getting millions of views all of a sudden? Like, it's nerve-wracking. And everybody wanted to do an interview with me. And I really shy, didn't want to do any interviews. And then I thought, I know somebody who needs attention. And I thought of Ed. And everybody who contacted me for an interview, I redirected them to Ed. I built Ed a website. I put a donate button on his website, put the portrait that we had created of him on his website, and I had convinced my new contacts at CNN to run Ed's story. And they did. They ran Ed's story for about a month. And Ed got national, international, global attention for his problem. And a year later, all these doctors from around the world were contacting Ed, and Ed got his tumor removed. The artwork had literally been used to help this guy. And so at that point, Ed's getting help. Thousands of artists around the country are making portraits of Barack Obama. Obama art became this thing that the Obama campaign very cleverly adopted, right? And the political organizations have a lot of affiliates in the media. They would feed the artists, press. They would give them these rewards, and artists would make more and more art. And it was really intelligent for the Obama campaign to latch onto that and encourage these artists to make all these portraits of Obama. It was insane. So, for the better or worse, the Obama art thing became a thing. And I realized at this point that art not only had the ability to communicate a meaningful message, but it had the power to change the world. And I think Ed is a good example of that. I think Obama is a good example of it. During this time, Obama had his best friend from high school come and find me in Washington, D.C. and tell me that I was his favorite artist, which is a really nice compliment from the President of the United States and someone who's as highly esteemed as he is. I'm not really a fan of anyone still at this point, but, you know, um, difficult when you drop bombs on a country and you receive the Nobel Peace Prize the same week. That's complicated for me. So at this point, I decided that I should quit teaching. I should move back to New York City. And I should focus on just making art just a little bit. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to inspire critical thinking through these artworks. When you create a complex artwork, you have people that engage with it, and in order to understand it, they have to think critically. In order for them to understand how the thing is actually working, they have to take it apart a little bit. Just like looking up into the clouds and seeing images in the clouds, you have to suspend disbelief and allow yourself to see something that's there in front of you. It's a form of critical thinking. When you do that, you start the ball rolling with critical thinking, and when we do that, we're moving in the right direction, I think. This is a piece called The Immigrant. It's a portrait of my wife. She is an immigrant. This piece is about how beautiful and complex a person she is and how important immigrants are to diverse communities. Thank you.